Good morning. We'll start. We're a little bit late. Apologies for that. There was a problem, situation, some security situation on 14th Street. So we are a little bit late. But let me start by welcoming you all here on behalf of Cindy Arson and myself, the Latin American program in the Brazil Institute. This is the second time in a couple of years that we hold this type of event. First time we did a Brazil's growing presence in the region, Latin America in general. This time we decided to focus on Brazil and South America, and it came from various facts. One that we highlight in the invitation. When President Dilma Rousseff took office January last year, she announced that with vehemence and firmness, Brazil's decision to associate its economic, social, and political development with the continent of South America. She specifically mentioned the Mercosur trade bloc, the UNASUR, as essential components in the construction of a multipolar world. Brazil and its immediate neighborhood have been connected at least in three major ways in the last century. Brazil basically discovers its neighborhood a century ago, or a little bit more than that, when the founder of Brazilian modern diplomacy and a group of advisors took to the job of consolidating Brazilian borders. I'm referring obviously to José Maria da Silva Paranhos, the Baron of Rio Branco, who was the foreign minister of Brazil to 1902, 1912. We recently marked the 100th year of his passing. During a period that starts before he becomes foreign minister, Rio Branco and a group of diplomats in Brazil negotiated with the neighbors without a single fire being shot, a single gunfire being shot, the current borders of Brazil. This is a very important moment of discovery of the region, basically associated with the Plate River Basin. Go 50, 60 years forward, you will see another encounter in the context of the Cold War. A group of Brazilian militants, Brazilian intellectuals that are forced to leave the country and connect with their colleagues and rebuild their lives in neighboring countries. Obviously, Chile is a central country in that story because it's the country that received so many Brazilians, starting with a sociologist by the name Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Actually, Cardoso in his book says that's when he discovered South America. That's when he discovered Latin America. More recently, in the 80s, you have Brazilian companies also discovering the region. And I think that we are going to try to bring the three dimensions to this first of two panels on this conference today on Brazil and South America. The first panel we will hear from Ambassador Antonio Simões, Undersecretary for South America at the Brazilian Foreign Ministry, and now it can be told, soon to be made the Undersecretary for Political Affairs at Itamaraty. I am not going to read the bios. You have their bios, but Simões has been involved in negotiations, in building the relationship with the neighbors, immediate neighbors, in many different ways. More important, as a former ambassador to Venezuela. With us also is Ricardo Senes, director and partner of Prospectiva Consultoria Internacional. Ricardo is a dear friend of the Brazil Institute, participated with us in previous efforts, especially one involving innovation. He was actually a junior scholar at the Wilson Center when he was pursuing his master's degree in the United States. Last but not least, Sergio Fausto. Sergio is the executive director of the Instituto Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Sergio is a writer, an analyst, publishes regularly in Estado de São Paulo and other publications, and has driven with some colleagues very important debates on under the Carta Democrática on how Brazil connects and engages with the region. So as typical of Brazil's in democracy, you will hear probably three different views, three different perspectives on how a continental nation like Brazil deals with its 10 immediate neighbors. And again, thank you for being here. After we conclude this panel, we have a short break, and then Cindy will preside over the second panel that will have very also knowledgeable, important, and engaged people. I just wanted to mention their names and recognize them. Ambassador Juan Gabriel Valdés, former Foreign Minister of Chile. Ambassador Gustavo Fernandes, former Foreign Minister of Bolivia. Ana Maria San Juan, Senior Advisor of the Andean Development Corporation in Venezuela. Juan Gabriel Tocatlian, Professor at the University Torquato di Tella in Argentina. And Juan Esteban Orduz, the President of the Colombian Coffee Federation. With that, I would invite Ambassador Simões to start us off. You can speak from there, or if you prefer, you can come here in the podium.
Você vai falar de lá ou daqui? Ou daqui? Vamos falar daqui também. Okay, so I think I'll be here. Hello, so good morning. I would like, first of all, to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for this invitation. Also, I would like to mention that it's a pleasure for me being here with an old friend like Paulo Sotero, also Ricardo Senes, that I know for such a long time, and making new friends like Sergio Fausto. I also acknowledge here the presence of some people that I dealt with before a lot, like Ana Maria San Juan or Carlos Portales from Chile, friends from all the experience in diplomatic life. Here today, I will try to make a picture of how Brazil approaches its relations with the neighbors. I will try to be a little bit schematic, and I try to show what's our vision, what's the vision of the country Brazil today, what's the vision of this country about the neighbors, and also what is our vision about two of the most important initiatives we have, Mercosur and UNASUR. I try to show what's our strategy, what's the view of the Brazilian government, and of course I will try to show how things are working today. Of course, when we read the papers today and we see some news about China or about the growth in India or about problems in Spain, of course we have to reassess the situation after everything is more clear. But what I'm trying to do today is not talking about this, is talking about what is our strategy and how we view our neighbors in what is the common project that we have. So this is my proposal for today. Well, first thing I would like to mention is that foreign policies, they are not made in a vacuum. Foreign policies, they are shaped, thinking about what are the political and what are the economic conditionalities that will help shaping it. So I think it's important when we think about the Brazilian foreign policy, and specifically the Brazilian foreign policy for the region, that we think about what is Brazil today. And to have an idea of what is Brazil today, I think we have to think that historically Brazil has experienced what I would say 4 major liabilities all along his process. And these 4 major liabilities, it blocked the development of the country for such a long time, and also blocked a more assertive foreign policy. The first major liability was the scourge of slavery and social exclusion. Most Brazilians for many time were excluded from the economic system of the country. Millions and millions of Brazilians were outside the economic system. The second liability was the external debt. Brazil was born as a nation with a big external debt that inherited from Portugal. It was the debt of Portugal with England, and this was, let's say, something we have to pay to get our independence. And Brazil has been, for such a long time, the biggest debtor among emerging countries. The third liability was oil dependency. It became very famous in Brazil, a report made by an American in the 60s saying that there was no oil in Brazil. And for such a long time, there was no oil in Brazil. And it's true that the oil that we found, and we found a lot of oil, is not in Brazil. It's on the sea. So in a certain way, the Link report was not completely wrong. And the fourth big liability was the fact that while Brazil has been a very big coffee exporter since the 19th century, we've been highly dependent on importing agricultural products, especially wheat. Well, all this picture with these 4 big liabilities has dramatically changed in the last 10 years. Following transition to democracy in the 80s and the economic stability that we achieved in the 90s with the government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, under Lula and Dilma, a kind of social revolution was initiated and continues to operate in Brazil. In this social revolution, a quiet revolution, we had more than 30 million people that entered the middle class. And this new middle class, that's not an American middle class, it's a much poorer middle class, but it's a middle class that would consume our cars, our refrigerators, our computers. And these people, they impeded Brazil from experiencing very bad effects of the crisis on 2008, and even today is helping the country, even if the growth this year will not be the marvelous growth we expected, but the difference is much smaller. We are not growing so less than people would expect. We are not experiencing the effect of India, for instance. The difference will not be so big, and especially because of this new middle class. The second point that changed is the foreign debt. Today we have reserves of more than $360 billion, and this is well above the public debt that is $200 billion. So in this sense, maybe for the first time in history, Brazil is a net foreign creditor, which is quite a difference. Third, the oil dependence is being transformed into an oil boom. Brazil, the expectation is that by 2020, Brazil will be one of the 5 world's oil producers. So this is quite a change for a country that there was no oil in it. And last but not the least, we developed a kind of green revolution. And today we are a major player not only on coffee as before, but on meat, poultry, pork, soya beans, corn, sugar, and more important than that, not only the agribusiness, but what we call family agriculture. That's to say, a new middle class in rural areas has developed, and this family agriculture today is responsible for 70% of what Brazilians eat. So it's quite a change from the past. In this sense, the former liabilities have become our present and future assets. And the Brazilian foreign policy strategy has to reflect these changes. Now, speaking a little bit more about South America after this general picture of Brazil today, historically, the lack of economic and political ties was the rule in South America. We have 2 different sides in South America, the Portuguese side and the Spanish side. And the idea since the beginning is that both sides would be completely disconnected and connected with the North. The idea in the colony is that you will have competition, not integration among the 2 sides of South America. So what we have to do, what we're trying to do, is something to change, something that historically was exactly the opposite. And integration moved from, let's say, in the beginning, in the 50s, in the 60s, a lot of rhetoric, but we moved then from what I would call real integration with more economic integration, and Mercosur was very important in doing that, especially in the 90s, and also political integration, and this especially in the last 10 years with UNASUR. Why South America is important for Brazil today? Why Brazil is so interested in working more and more with the neighbors? There is something that John Kennedy said. He said, a free society cannot help the many who are poor. If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. So the question is that we would think Brazil is not willing to be rich alone. We don't want to grow alone. We would like our neighbors also to grow. We would like also our neighbors to be integrated in the process, that all the region will improve. We think that this will add to us development, prosperity, and avoid instability. So it's very important to us, this concept. It's interesting also to note that despite the fact that last year we've reached the point of being the 6th largest economy in the world, maybe this year will change a little bit because of the exchange rates, and we'll go to the 7th place. I don't know exactly how it will be, but the important thing is that the economic weight that we have is still not clearly perceived internally in Brazil. So if you go on the street and you ask someone about that, a common citizen, maybe the person will not realize that, will not know that. And when this person will react with one of our neighbors, he will also react not thinking of that, not understanding the weight of Brazil in relation to the neighbors. So this is very important to understand many things and understand why in Brazil there are some voices that say that Brazil should be stricter with some of the neighbors. They don't know that. The reality is that if we just take not the GDP, but if we just take the reserves, the hard currency reserves, as I said before, $360 billion. Only these reserves, they are bigger than the economy of 10 of our neighbors, just the reserves. So this is something that we have to understand, not to be proud of, but we have to understand to see that we have to understand very clearly the position of the country. Otherwise, you cannot build a policy a foreign policy that will work for the country and also for the neighbors. And having all this in mind is that we've been developing a policy that mix two different concepts, pragmatism and solidarity. Let me explain a little bit more what are those concepts to us. First, our policy is pragmatic. Why? Because it's anchored on real interests. Commercially, South America is very important for Brazilian companies. It's the first area of expansion. It's where Brazilian companies are becoming transnational corporations. And if we take if you look just for some examples, we see that in Venezuela, Brazilian companies would have contracts up to $20 billion. That in Argentina, our presence in the oil sector, in the consumer sector, in the banking sectors has becoming bigger and bigger. That, for instance, Petrobras answers for 25% of Bolivia's fiscal income. So we have to understand that on the pragmatic side, this is a reality today, and also the investment of many of our neighbors in Brazil. Besides pragmatism, our foreign policy is also based on solidarity. And what is solidarity? And first thing, we have to make a distinction between what we call solidarity and what some would call generosity, which is completely different. Generosity is an unilateral act. It's something that you give to someone that has no condition to give back anything to you. And this is not something good, looking at our neighbors. We don't look at them like that. We prefer looking and having the concept of solidarity. What this means? This means that we have inside the concept of solidarity also an element of reciprocity. Reciprocity according to one's capacity. In a process that if we would understand the neighbor and in a certain way will help the neighbor on some aspects, we also understand that the neighbor will be in a position to help us according to their own possibilities. So this is a more reciprocal process that also will give value to the contributions from our neighbors. So it's important also that we, with solidarity, we will focus more on our common interests and not on the differences. This is something very important. Pragmatism and solidarity are the pillars of two of the most important South America regional fora that we have, Mercosur and UNASUR. In 2011, Mercosur celebrated 20 years. And in those 20 years, we went from a trade from $4 billion to $47 billion among Mercosur countries. The trade increase between 2002 and 2011 reached 430%. This is bigger than the increase of Brazil's trade in the same period, which was 350%. That's to say, we are in the last 10 years, the trade between Mercosur grew more than the general trade of Brazil. It's interesting to note that 90% of our export to Argentina are manufactured products. And it's interesting to note that 75% of the export of Argentina to Brazil are also manufactured products. 40% of all Argentina manufacturing exports go to Brazil. And 5 out of 10 cars that are produced in Argentina are running on Brazilian streets. Regarding Uruguay and Paraguay, we developed a development fund called FOSEM. This is not financing. This is a fund that you give the money to promote structural changes in those countries. Under FOSEM, we are building, for instance, in Paraguay, a transmission line that it's $500 million that will completely change Paraguay because it will enable Paraguay to use the energy of Itaipu Dam that Paraguay shares with Brazil, and will create a new reality for the economy of Paraguay. This is fully funded by Brazil, this transmission line. When we view Mercosur, it's true that if we use a traditional or a Cartesian view of economic integration process, Mercosur is not perfect. It's not perfect at all. We were based on the model of the European Union, and sometimes people say that we should follow more this model. But looking at the reality of the European Union today, we understand that maybe it was better that we didn't, we were not a such good student. We didn't follow it rightly. And the point is that we have to understand that as countries are very different, as countries are, the economy of the countries are very different, we have to try to find a win-win situation. And in a certain way, to cope with the asymmetries of Mercosur, the imperfections of Mercosur, they have a role to play. I'm not in favor of being imperfect. What I'm telling is that sometimes we have to understand that if we go on a very strict way, then maybe we will not have the best result. Also, another point that is important is to understand, and now turning to UNASUR, is that in UNASUR we try to promote the coexistence of different views. We have some countries that believe more in state intervention in South America. We have some countries that believe more on liberal policies. And Brazil is trying to bridge the gap and trying to foster ideas that everybody would support, like regional peace, advancing democracy, sharing successful social and health policies, combating drug trafficking. So UNASUR is trying to consolidate this framework. It has 80 sectorial councils, and it's working on health, infrastructure, defense, drugs, many issues. And now, also in Colombia, we agreed to work on public security, and we will shape new policies to combat drugs and transnational crime. It's interesting for us to understand that as the same role that the European Union had in leveling the playing field and in helping those countries that were lagging behind on certain standards, UNASUR will have the same role as we think. And we think that this can bring benefits not only for the region but elsewhere also. It's also important to note that we believe that Brazil has to act in this way to being a positive force, promoting trade, promoting cooperation, promoting standards. But we don't want to impose anything. What we have we have a model of social insertion of the poor, we have a model of solidarity and pragmatism that we wish to share with our neighbors. To conclude, I would like to quote Professor Lisa Martin from Wisconsin Madison University. Martin said, states can choose from a wide array of organizing forms as pattern by which to organize interaction among themselves. These forms could vary from unilateralism, multilateralism, including bilateralism, and even imperialism. I started this saying, how does Brazil approach its relations with the neighbors? Definitely, we don't believe in unilateralism. I would say that what Brazil has chosen is the path of a truly multilateral regional framework. And we understand that maybe this is a slower track. We understand that it will require a lot of patience and political wisdom, but we also understand that this is the only sustainable way in the long term for us and for our neighbors. Thank you very much.
Oh, can I make a comment on climate change?
Yes, sir.
Can you lower the air conditioner? I'm freezing.
This is a problem here at the Wilson Center. We have been dealing with that in the last 6 years that I've been here. Is there a solution? I think we're going to hold a UN conference on that specific one, because actually the dining room also it's a problem. So, but we will.
Okay, don't worry.
It will.
I will survive.
The next, that we have no people always leave here alive. So it's we move next to Ricardo Senes. Do you prefer to use the
Actually, I
podium?
prefer to speak from
Yeah,
here.
maybe it's best that you speak from here because you can control the. It's in here. Yeah. Okay.
Soon as I- Yeah. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with my friends, an honor to be with Ambassador Simões. A lot of people that I have been in the last, 20 years discussing Latin America, Rolf, Andrew, Juan, Ana Maria, and it's always a pleasure to be here, Paulo and Sergio. Well, I organized an argument about the views and the strategies of Brazil to South America. That I have been working both in private sector and also in a university. So it's not just my hypothesis. I think it's some hypothesis that a group of people have been working with. The first topic, I think, as Ambassador Simões mentioned, I think we have to understand the regional perspective of Brazil, the South American strategy of Brazil, is connected with the global foreign strategy of Brazil. And the global strategy of Brazil has been changing in the last 20 years for the reasons that the Ambassador mentioned, and I would combine with several others. I think the new postures that Brazil has globally has been impacting the traditional alliance of the country, have been impacting how the Brazil choose the global forums that they prefer to work with. So there is a clear movement of some oligarch, small groups that deals with international issues has been kind of not a priority, but it's some space that Brazil has been pursuing, like G20 financial issues or some other issues like the reform of United Nations, this kind of stuff. But we also have huge changes in our in our interests, strategies, and postures, also in the economic sense. Again, as an ambassador mentioned, Brazil currently it has two very interesting situations. It's one of the biggest country in attracting foreign investment, and not just foreign investment to domestic market, but also as a regional platform. At the same time, Brazil has been investing abroad a lot. So this position as foreign investor is a completely new situation for the Brazil government and society. And Brazil has been trying to adapt this kind of stuff. And I think that Brazil currently, as I suggest here in very below note, we are kind of a middle power, independent middle power. We make a kind of transition both from economic sense and political sense. That's not exactly what Mexico did, or even Korea, that changed the traditional third world approach for something like OECD and G8 approach. We are in somewhere in between of these two situations. About the region, look, this is a pool made by a professor in Brazil, a researcher in Brazil called Mauri Souza. They interview 400 people from several different areas of the country, of the society, but they choose specifically the elite of the country. They ask them, I was included in this list, the main external threats that Brazil perceives in their perception. With the red arrow was this external threat that has a regional element. It is in Portuguese, but the first one is international drug trafficking. The fourth one is the broke of democracy in South America, so on. I think important to keep in mind that 6 or 7 of the 15 major threats come from the region. At the same time, when they ask many external goals of Brazil, again, the region appears as in the top list of the priorities that include guarantee of democracy in South America, infrastructure integration, to foster Brazilian leadership, regional leadership, and so on. So that I think is very interesting to understand how Brazil perceives the region. It's a threat in some sense, but it is also an opportunity and a strategic goal in another sense. Look, this is not a pool that covers all the Brazilian society. They cover the elite, what they call elite. Because there is in Brazil, as Ambassador mentioned, the perception about foreign presence of Brazil, including the regional strategies, has a huge gap. The perception from the elite has a gap about the perception about the whole society, including media, etc. I think, unfortunately, the view of the society in Brazil is very poor. We are not trained to think internationally. So, to try to organize some of these hypotheses that I mentioned in the beginning of the speech, SEBRE, Brazilian think tank on international issues, they made twice a task force on South America. And I was, again, part of this task force. And what I think is the most interesting result of this task force was the task force didn't have a single view about South America. We have 2 different views. It was about 40 people from different areas. In the end, it was impossible to reach a position paper that represents all the vision. And the vision was divided. In the end, we decided to divide the 2 visions as a predominant in the group. One, what we call the selective regional commitments strategy. There was a clear group of people who works with South America that think that that thought at that time, was 3 years ago, that Brazil should pursue a kind of selective commitment strategy. That means specific agreements, regional agreements, focus on specific issues, but not necessarily covered by a long-term institutional integration or whatever. The second group that I was part of was what they call the South American Aid Strategic Option. What this means? That all in the perception of this group, the major geopolitical, political, and economic issues should be handled, in terms of Brazil, should be handled regionally. That includes environment, investment, industrial policy, intellectual property, whatever. That's our perception at that time. So, we have, again, keep in mind that we have this kind of different approach in Brazilian elite. When you try to analyze the official strategy of Brazil, I would say, the diplomatic strategy, the postures and the actions that come from the government, for sure, as Ambassador said also, UNASUR seems to be one of the reference. UNASUR, I think, for the dimension, the diplomatic dimension, is clearly a central piece of the strategy in the region. There is a history on this. Sorry. There is a series of initiatives. One of them is Defense Council, that I think is one of the most important initiatives with some results. But at the same time, it's a kind of initiative that do not suffer much resistance from competitors. But at the same time, I think this initiative doesn't have such a regional support. There is some, but not a full regional support. Anyway, from Brazil perspective, continue to be a centerpiece. The other axis of the Brazilian regional strategy is Mercosur. In this case, I think the expansion of Mercosur to become a South American agreement, this, I think, in this aspect, in this dimension, the Brazilian strategy have been suffering problems, suffering some resistance, both resistance and competition. This map do not represent all the agreements that the countries in the region have, not just the intra-regional agreements, but agreements with countries abroad. But there is clear that in that specific aspect, we do have competition and resistance at the same time, differently from the case of UNASUR. This is just an example. Is the preferential trade agreements that was registered in WTO. We can see that when you take agreements inside South America, is even it's 13, if I read correct. But trade agreements from South American countries with North America in the last, I think, 15 years is about 16. So we have been losing space in terms of trade liberalization initiatives. At the same time, intra-region trade continues to grow very fast, as, again, Simões mentioned. This means that even though we don't have a single market in the region, the trade in the region have been growing very fast. In specific with Argentina, you can see the numbers. It's a significant part of Brazilian exportation. Of course, with several problems. This small table just gives some examples of the very recently bilateral trade barriers that we raised, unfortunately. How important is the regional trade for Brazil? It's strategically for a country that have put in so much money in industrialization, industrial policy, and all fostering domestic company of whatever. It's something like 23%, but almost 90% of this exportation is industrialized goods. Part of them Brazil cannot export for other markets. It's exactly the opposite of the profile of the foreign trade that we have with China. That's another 25%. China, it's a shame. It's 93% of our exports to China. It's just two products. Iron ore in soybean. So this is strategic, mainly for my state, São Paulo state, even though the states of São Paulo elite do not perceive this. Together with this movement, Brazilian companies have been growing very fast. This list presented the largest public companies in Latin America. Brazil, we include Mexico here, but 12 from these 20 companies listed here are Brazilians. If we take Mexico out, would be more like a 60 from the biggest 20 company in the region. There is of course consequence for our regional trade and investment. The regional investment of Brazil has been also growing a lot. We made a list of large and middle-sized Brazilian companies in Argentina, and we found 196. That means when you have in a country like Brazil, 196 company operating in Argentina through a direct investment, that means that's not just big companies. It's big and small size. It's not concentrated in one sector. It's very much in different sectors, operating in different sectors. Again, with a large, important political consequence, economic consequence. For instance, we have the Brazilian group in Argentina. Brazilian group is a kind of interest group in Argentina, with some negotiation. The same, of course, will happen in different areas. It's the U.S. Business Association in Brazil. They are a group of interest, and they are acting politically. Brazil, foreign investors, start to operate politically and economically in different countries, not just in Argentina, but also in Peru, in Venezuela, and other. This is something that we have to understand and to include. Part of these foreign investments are supported by government. This present the numbers about BNDES, sorry, the Brazilian Development Bank. We are talking about 500 million per year in spending in loans for company operating in the region. And you can see, sorry. Now you can see that the majority of these loans go to infrastructure sectors. But this is an example. This does not cover everything. Well, now, this division about in Brazilian society, how to understand the region, the South America, how to design Brazilian strategy, how to pursue Brazilian interests, are not homogeneous both in the society, in the business sector, and the government. This, I think, is a critical issue. If you take the Brazilian government, or I would say Brazilian state in a broad sense, the intensivity of regional interests as a strategic goal are completely different from the presidency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Central Bank, the Minister of Energy, and somehow. In some way, these different agencies in the government operates very differently in terms of regional strategies. This is a problem, I think. It's a real problem. But not just in the executive branch. The legislative branch is another critical area to think about South America. I would say in foreign issues in general, but in South America specific, it's very much complicated. There is no appeal for legislative in Brazil. It's no initiative, nothing. State-owned companies, a very important difference among them. If you take Petrobras, Eletrobras, BNDES, or Correios, or Bank of Brazil, they have different approach for South America again. All the other federal agencies, the regulatory agencies, etc., and also subnational entities. We can apply these two first views that I presented, the selective commitment approach to South America and the strategic view about South America in that agencies, in federal government. And we will perceive some of them are part of one group, more strategic one, and the other much more close to the selective commitment, regional commitments. But the private sector, the business sector, also are very much divided. Another problem that we have to face, because of course we have to work together in a sense to build the idea of the strategic sense of South America, but we don't have this. So we have at least four different groups in terms of business sector that we use the idea of. Some of them have a strategic interest in the region. That means they have strong trade, strong investment, and they demand rules, common rules. That means integration. The second group, they don't want to work with the region for any issue. I would say that agribusiness sector, for instance, the majority of the agribusiness sector. The third group, they only are only interested in trade, not rules, not investments. In another group, that interest in investments, not necessarily trade, not necessarily integration. Sometimes investments are combined with a global strategy of the company, not necessarily combined with a regional strategy. I don't have time, but to go on that direction. But I think just to give some example how you can classify the interest of different agencies. And here I think is important. If you make a qualitative approach for the engagement of these institutions, federal institutions, and the capacity of them in influence regulatory issues and mobilize and use resource. So we have a lack. We have a lack of what we call coalition inside the government that at the same time has a strategic interest in work with the region in terms of integration, or at least this convergence, strategic convergence in the long term. Because the institutions that do have this interest, they don't have enough resource to work. They have to convince and work with the other agents and try to bring some of them. I think the government, or part of the government who works with South America, have been very well succeeded in take some of these institutions to projects related to regional integration. But it's not the common. That is not the common outcome of this internal debate on the government. The same happened with this, the private sector. I would say at least two sectors are very much engaged in regional activities in a strategic sense. It's the automotive industry, the chemistry, the energy is moving in that direction, but it's not already there. Only trade interest, all the middle tech industry in Brazil, machinery, electronics, electronic equipment, service as IT, business service, airlines, and whatever. Investment interest. Almost all major Brazilian companies have investments in the region. Not necessarily, as I said, connect with a regional strategy. And agribusiness as, I think, the more significant player that really operates in a different sense rather than South America. Is trying to apply the same idea of trying to connect the level of interest of these groups with the economic importance in terms of exports and importance in GDP, we will have something like this in this private sector. Again, we have a very small group that really fits in this strategic box in top. Even though we have a lot of other sectors that do have regional interests, regional relations, trade or investment. I think the challenge here is move this group up and try to design strategies that are feasible in terms of economic sense and feasible in terms of political sense. That's, I think, is the major challenge that Brazil are facing, not just the government, but all the people who works with these issues. So, in terms of conclusions, I would say the Brazil as a whole, not in terms of diplomacy, but as a whole, as the presence of Brazil as a country, has been following a very multifaceted pattern in terms of regional relations. Regional integration, that would be the regional integration with strategic purpose, is just one of the options. The other 8 entities, public entities, private sector associations, have been working with different ideas about the region that include part of this selective regional commitments strategy. A lack of domestic support to lead regional integration as a complete package, as I think is the idea, to have this more European approach about regional integration rather than the NAFTA, the North American approach. Clearly, I think the strategy of the Brazilian government is move in direction of more European approach to regional integration, but we still have a lack of support domestically for this, both in the state level and business level. At the same time, I think Brazil has been very successful, not very, I would say successful, in construct in the last 20 years some institutions that clearly fostered convergence, not necessarily integration, but some kind of convergence. I would say that UNASUR is the best example. IRSA, the infrastructure, regional South American infrastructure initiative, that is moving, slowly, but is moving. Mercosul expansion. And CAF. CAF, I think, just one very brief note. CAF, I think CAF, in my perception, is the most important initiative that we have. Actually, not CAF. CAF is the Andean Developing Bank Corporation. Corporation. But in the last 5 years, CAF became South America, not just. Sorry? Now Latin America. I would prefer South America, but anyway, you include more than South America. Yeah. That means that Brazil, Argentina, and other countries that wasn't part of the Class A in the board of CAF, they became Class A in terms of in the board, and also put money on this bank. I think CAF would be, I hope so, the BNDES, the National Brazilian Developing Bank in South America. I think this is very critical element, and I think even more that Banco Sur or some initiative in that direction. This movement I think, will have a lot of consequence, and I think it's very important to follow what's going on in CAF, in the regional role of CAF. And of course, the intensification of the social and market regional interaction in the last 20 years is another fact. Again, is not necessarily related to the Brazilian strategy to foster Mercosul or UNASUR, etc. It's something that the market and the society is moving. And the combination of at least these 4 different movements are producing what I think we have today. And I think the role of Brazil in this new phase is try to really adjust what we have currently in our domestic, political, and economic situation, and try to adjust and translate this for the new regional approach in our strategy of development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. Well, now we'll hear remarks by Sergio. Do you want to speak? Come here?
No,
or
no,
to
I'll
go
speak from
over
here.
there? Okay.
Hey, hello everyone. Let me start by saying thanks to Paulo Sotero and the Brazil Institute for this invitation for the Latin American program, and Cindy Arson for the same invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I will cut my presentation shorter so that we can have time for a discussion, right? And I will try to be as thought-provoking as possible. Now, my idea here is not to underplay the importance of Brazil and Brazil weight and Brazil leadership in the region. I will not try to contradict what has been said before me, but I will shed light on constraints and limits that Brazil leadership faces in the region. They are of two natures. One is external constraints, and other are domestic constraints. With regards to external constraints, I would like to emphasize basically 2 points. One is the fact that South America is a very, very heterogeneous region with regards to models of development and strategies of competitive or some kind of insertion in the global economy and in the international system. I think it's obvious for everyone that there are countries that follow and have been following pretty much consistently, let's say a liberal free trade kind of strategy. I would mention Peru. Most of them, and this is something important to keep in mind, most of them are located on the Pacific coast of the region, specifically Chile, Peru, also Colombia, right? And these countries are countries they have free trade agreements with the U.S. They're very much polarized by Asia. And the kind of strategies that they have chosen to pursue are not necessarily, this is an understatement, right? Not necessarily convergent with the strategies that have been adopted by countries like Bolivia, like Venezuela, like Ecuador, and that kind of thing, right? The fact that we are still experiencing, and I think structurally we can envisage a long cycle of high commodity prices in the international market, implies that at the same time you have this liberal free trade countries very much connected to Asia being benefited and polarized by this new magnet of the global economy. And at the same time, the rents that have been captured by Bolivarian states, some kind of more statist kind of development in the region, are reinforced by the same economic phenomenon, right? The other important thing to keep in mind, and I already mentioned it implicitly, is the fact that in a multipolar world, countries of the region have more than one alternative in terms of partnerships, right? So in a way, they're not condemned to follow Brazil leadership. I think they will follow Brazil in leadership to the extent and in as much as this leadership is perceived as beneficial to them, right? They have other partners in other sources of finance and other sources of investment and other sources of even military equipment and that kind of thing, right? So I think the basic message here is when you look at the playing field, regional and the global playing field, Brazilian leadership in the region faces a lot of constraints that should be reckoned. With regards to internal constraints, let me begin by saying that we have to keep in mind that in spite of the fact that Brazil is clearly the biggest country in the region, Brazil has not the highest per capita income in the region. That means that Brazil has a lot of asymmetries inside of the country. Right? In addition, Brazil is a federation with a lot of regional elites, right? In the interests of different regions, and with a lot of asymmetries in terms of level of development between them, have to be accommodated in a way or another within the state priorities and the state budget, right? So you can imagine that in a country with these characteristics, demands that are not domestic demands do not take a priority in policies and in the allocation of public revenues. It is true that Brazil has been extremely active in diplomatic terms, and I think has been doing a good job as trying to play this role of a bridge between in a, let's say, in a more or less divided region between Bolivarian countries and more liberal ones. And I think Brazil has been playing this skillfully. And this has to do with the competence of the Foreign Service, the fact that we have three able presidents in a row, from Cardoso to Dilma. But when it comes to commit, let's say, real resources to the region, Brazil is very modest in this respect. Let me just give you some numbers. FOSEN has been mentioned here, which is the fund that is meant to finance, let's say, productive integration and to deal with asymmetries between countries within Mercosur. Brazil's financial contribution to FOSEN is less than 1.0% of total BNDES lending, annually speaking, right? I think this number tells a lot about the level of commitment. I'm not criticizing Brazil, I'm just showing facts that I think, let's say, are hard to question, right? Ricardo has shown a chart here with the total lending of BNDES linked in a way or another, especially dedicated to infrastructure projects in South America. I mean, the curve is impressive, but when you look at the vertical axis, you see the absolute numbers, right? And the absolute number in 2010 was $500 million. What was the total lending of the BNDES in the same year? $90 billion. That tells something, right? That tells something. Brazil is still very much a self-centered country. Oil and gas industry, big opportunity. We have established a policy of local content in order to stimulate the local industry of providers to the oil and gas industry. Do we have a policy to open this market to members of the Mercosur. In other words, when we say local content, we say equipments and services provided by Brazilian companies located within Brazil. Let's come back to BNDES. The BNDES does give money only to Brazilian companies. When the BNDES finance the exports of Brazilian services and equipments to South America, even in the modality of a buyer's credit, it's a conditionality of the loan that only Brazilian providers can get that money. So, in spite of our activism in the region, right? When you let's say, when things boil down to, let's say, to the real hard facts, Brazil is still a very much self-centered country. Investments in the region, it's a big and new phenomenon. No? But it does, of course, this will, in a way, tip the balance in favor of Brazil. So the weight of Brazil will increase on the wake of these investments. But look, are these investments pointing to a decrease in the level of asymmetry? Are they of a nature that bodes well in terms of generating productive integration or not, right? I will not give an answer to this question, but I think this is a question we have to keep in mind. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is South America, and it's linked to the answer to the question I've just posed. South America is a key strategic market for Brazilian manufactured exports. And Brazil is increasing its manufactured exports to South America. I think around 10 percentage points since 1992. But let's look the other way around. Does Brazil buy a lot of products from the neighborhood? Right? No. If you take the figures, the participation of South American imports in total Brazilian imports is virtually stagnant, right? So it's what kind of leadership can you build on this basis and in such a scenario? Are we committed with policies that can, let's say, change this picture or not? As I told you before, I think our level of commitment is really, really, really restrained, right? And this is not by chance. I'm not criticizing this or that administration. This is a choice made by Brazilian elite and Brazilian society. It's a choice made by Brazilian elite with the backing of Brazilian society. Final word. Which is the sector that is growing faster in the Brazilian economy? It's the agribusiness sector. And it will presumably go even faster in the years to come. The global demand for food is huge, right? China may decelerate in the short term, but it will shift gear in the demand for food not for mineral commodities in it, will increase. Brazil is extremely well positioned to take profit of this increasing global demand coming from Asia and China specifically. Does this structural trend bodes well in terms of South American integration? You've just mentioned, Ricardo, that the sector in the Brazilian economy which is the least interested in regional integration is the agribusiness sector. I'm not saying whether they're right or wrong, but I'm just taking, and I think this is true, right? I will stop here with a provocative question. Is any surprise that Brazilian focus on the IRSA projects, right, is related to transoceanic high roads, highways that will allow the exports of agricultural commodities from the hinterland of Brazil to Asia, right? Is that the kind of integration that is seen as mutually beneficial by our neighbors? So I think it's interesting, and I'll really stop here. When we think about leadership, it's good to put ourselves on the shoes of the people or country we want to lead, right? And I think we haven't thought it through in Brazil yet. Thank you for the opportunity, Paulo.
Thank you. Now, I think we're going to go a little bit over, and about 10 minutes for questions. Do you have any questions? Short questions. Please identify yourselves. First one at the center there. Yes, please.
It's not a short question, Paulo. I apologize.
No, but make it short, please. Edit it down.
Sure. Virtually all of what you talked about, thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting and enlightening to hear them. But I'm curious that virtually everything you talked about are the low politics of economics and investment. And I'm wondering if you could offer just a few words on Brazil's preparedness and the institutions it's involved with in South America, preparedness to respond to political crises or to security crises.
To security crisis, and the other one you mentioned?
Political crisis around the Venezuelan election, for example, and a potential major security crisis in the region.
Mr. Ambassador, I think the question is addressed to you.
Well, I think I went to you with the recent past, not with the future. We had 2 events. The first one was in Bolivia some years ago. The second one was in Ecuador, I think it was last year or the year before, that we had not a coup d'etat, but a threat or an instability. Some would say it was a coup d'etat. I'm not entering this dilemma here. But it was a threat to democracy in those 2 countries. In UNASUR meetings, the presidents met, or representatives of the presidents met, and could stop a process and could put the democracy back on track on those 2 countries. Normally, the script of this kind of thing would be to have a meeting at the OAS. There was a coup d'etat then, and then all the countries would recognize the new government. And the pattern was broken, because in those 2 countries, there was no coup d'etat, and democracy was respected. So I think that we have some elements today working in the region that are different from the past. If those if this could work in the future in new cases of instability, this is something that we have to see. But I think that there is something new in the horizon than we had in the past.
Sergio, you wrote a bit about this the other day regarding the possible development in Venezuela, and saying, if I recall the article, that Brazil and Colombia would have to play an important role in case of instability that developed as a consequence of the state of health of President Chavez. Could you just summarize what from your perspective?
Well, I think it's obvious to everyone how delicate the political situation is in Venezuela, right? And I think there is a real threat of political instability coming from various sides. And I think the main threat is a threat of the Venezuelan government, Chavismo without Chavez or with Chavez, to react to the perspective, non-democratically, to the perspective of being defeated in the presidential elections, right? And I think this is the kind of situation that, and I'm not trying to lecture anyone here because I'm not competent enough to tell how you should do that. But in a way or another, I think Brazil and Colombia should work, let's say, preemptively, sorry for the word, to give to send a clear message that anything but normal electoral procedures will not be accepted by the South American countries.
Okay. Questions? At the end, the back, very back there, please.
My name is Maite Robello. I am with the Americas program at CSIS. I just wanted to ask about the leadership role that Brazil wants to take in South America, and both Ambassador and Franco talked a little about it. Do you think there is any possibility that the regional countries, especially Argentina and Chile, would ever abide to this leadership role that Brazil intends to take within the global economic process?
Maybe I can go first and then.
Yes,
Okay. Well, two things. I think Chile is in a very structured way. Let's say Chile in the last 30 years has been making choices which, in my view, are not necessarily convergent with Brazil's leadership in the region, right? I think this is obvious to everyone. Well, the relationship with Argentina is by no means an easy one. This is another, let's say, maybe a failed assumption that Brazil leadership in the region would be built on an axis comprising Brazil, Argentina, and Venezuela with the leadership of Brazil. I think Brazil, let's say, overestimated its ability to control these partners, right? They are not what I would call, let's say, reliable partners when you take a long-term perspective, right?
Okay. Well, I think that on the government side, we don't feel that countries have to follow Brazil. We're not worried about that. What we're much more worried about is that we think that some ideas are key ideas to be followed by many countries. And these ideas would be stability, democracy, development, growth, social inclusion. So we concentrate much more in the concepts. I don't think that we will, for instance, if we take other regions, let's take Europe on the good side of the European Union. What went well there was exactly that countries followed certain ideas. It's not that countries would follow the leadership of Germany or the leadership of France or the leadership of the UK. I think what went well over there was that countries followed certain patterns, certain standards that improved in the region. So we have the same feeling. We feel that this feeling of following a leader is something of the past. We are not concentrated on that, and we don't think it's desired. This is something that we would desire, or this is something that will be possible in the end of the day.
Ricardo.
A very brief comment on this. I think leadership is a process, of course. And I will give back the question to you in a sense. Take the presence and the influence of Brazil in the South America 20 years ago and compare with today. Do we have more influence today in some specific issues that we had 20 years ago? I think yes. And mainly in some issues, as an ambassador mentioned, political stability, in the issues that we do have in the region, some convergence. The role of Brazil I think is very productive. The question is how to connect the other issues that is not already in the agenda. And I think this is, again, is a major challenge for Brazil. Should Brazil perceive a baseline agreement in the region a little bit above that we have today, in a sense of any democracy, human rights, or respect to investments, whatever. But I would say yes, Brazil has some room to increase a little bit the baseline agreement that we have in the region, and this role for Brazil, in my sense, is strategic.
There's just, I think, I would compliment, I'm just back from Brasilia where I had many conversations around this question. I sense that there has been a stylistic change in the way Brazil leads. Brazil is not, under President Dilma Rousseff, so worried about proclaiming leadership. Brazil is interested in focusing on its domestic, internal, economic growth. And there is, if I understand well, the belief is that there is an assumption that if Brazil treats its own economy correct, produces the economic growth, addresses those problems, given Brazilian weight and presence, the rest will come as a consequence. Obviously, it's important to articulate those consequences, but I don't sense, and I completely agree with the panelists, that this actually, Brazil's leadership, people are not thinking about that. People are not worried about that in Brazil. We have one very nano question. Do we have one very small? 1, 2, 3. Yes, in the back there. Yes. Go.
Yes. Thank you. I'm Enrique Ramirez with the Embassy of Paraguay here in Washington. I just have a question. Former President Lacalle of Uruguay was in Asunción recently. He gave a conference and he mentioned that Mercosur is more of a political bloc now, and he mentioned that it's a failure as an economic bloc and it's not working as it was meant to be originally. Just want to know your opinion about that, please.
Sir.
Okay. Well, I don't think it's a failure. I don't think that it's a bloc that went from $4 to $50 billion of trade is a failure. I agree that maybe we should invest more in the neighbors. But I think, for instance, for Paraguay that has a GDP of $15 billion, to have a transmission line of $500 million, that's not financed, that's a grant, is quite something. It's quite something, especially because it can bring new companies. It could formalize the economy. And even with Uruguay, we are building another transmission line to connect with Uruguay and to connect Uruguay to the Brazilian system. I don't think it's a failure. What I think it's the point is that the Mercosur that is a success, it works without noise. And the problems, we hear a lot about the problems. But I think that in the end of the day, what you have, I think it's a much more favorable effect than what we talk about.
Ambassador Antônio Simões, Sérgio Fausto, Ricardo Senes, thank you very much for this, for being here with us for this wonderful conversation. We will break for 10 minutes. It was 15, now it's going to be 10. And please be back in as soon as possible so we have the second conversation. Thank you very much.